Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Shubh. I'm a rising junior at NYU and I'm studying storytelling for film and television, and I suppose, by extension, also how to be a family disappointment. I grew up in India and Singapore, and now I live in New York. And let's get into today's episode. So we're going to split up today's episode into 4 segments. We'll start by discussing the movie of the week, which I've chosen to be The King of Staten Island, starring Pete Davidson. We'll then move on to comedic escapism, what to watch to numb yourself to the rest of the world outside. Today's pick will be Eurovision, the newest Will Ferrell movie. Followed by that, we'll discuss my spicy take of the week, which today is about Hindi films and Bollywood. We'll close off today with 5 movies I watched before coming to college in the US, just so you can understand a bit of where I come from and why I thought Superbad would explain how to fit in. Spoiler alert, it did not. So let's get into it. Alright, so for segment 1, we're going to talk about the movie of the week, which is The King of Staten Island. Now, The King of Staten Island is a film directed by Judd Apatow, starring and written by Pete Davidson. It's this semi-autobiographical dramedy about Pete Davidson's life if he'd never found stand-up comedy. So it follows this character. He plays Scott Carlin. Scott is actually his father's name, which is what a lot of the film is about. In real life, Pete Davidson lost his father, who was a firefighter, to 9/11. And the film follows his character, Scott Carlin, who deals with not only the trauma of losing his father at an early age, but also the trauma of his mother's new boyfriend, who is also a fireman. The film... Alright, so in terms of general impressions, I think there's 3 types of people in the world. There's people who have no idea who Pete Davidson is. Then there's people who love Pete Davidson, and in both of those cases I feel like you're going to have a really enjoyable movie experience. But there's also a third type of person, and that is if you're an Ariana Grande fan. And if I'm sorry to break it to you, if you're an Ariana Grande fan, you're probably not going to like this movie. So you might want to skip to the next segment. But if you're like me, and you love Pete Davidson, or if you've never heard of him before, I really suggest you watch this movie. And here's a few reasons why. So one of the things I said is that I'm a huge fan of Pete Davidson. I think his stand-up is incredible. It's this sort of dark humor that my generation has this affinity towards, because it brings such traumatic sort of topics that we have all dealt with growing up in this really dry and powerful humoristic take, which makes it sort of approachable. We all have our things that we're dealing with, and Pete Davidson is one of the beacons of light in that sort of struggle. He brings that sense and that tone to the film. One of the opening scenes is him hanging out with his friends. and they bring a new girl into the mix. And she asks Pete what the date on one of the tattoos on his arm means, and he says that's the date his father died. And everyone starts to get all really sort of icky over the topic of Pete's dad. They start sort of ostracizing her for bringing it up. But at the end, Pete's best friend, Scott's best friend, Oscar, I should say, says this joke. They reveal to her that he doesn't really care, which is an indication that Scott is, not really dealing with the pain and the trauma of his father's passing. But he says this joke that goes along the lines of, knock knock, to which Pete says, who's there? And he says, not your father. That's a very dark joke, but that's the sort of sense of humor of this film. But it's also the crux of the film. Scott Carlin, played by Pete Davidson, must deal with everything that makes him who he is. A good-for-nothing, procrastinating stoner who lives in his mom's house at the age of 24, with no future prospects and a dream to be a tattoo artist and open a restaurant called Ruby Tattoos Days, where customers can enjoy their food with a fresh side of ink. I just have to say, whoever came up with that idea, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. But that's sort of Judd Apatow's bread and butter. When you look at Judd Apatow's filmography, you see movies like This Is 40, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, Knocked Up. They're all about these man-child characters that are stuck and have to mature and change. And that's what this film is about. Which brings me to my point, that Judd Apatow was the perfect person to make this film. Now, first of all, Judd is at his best when he's shining the light on someone else's story. Like he did with Seth Rogen in Knocked Up, like he did with Amy Schumer in Trainwreck, Lena Dunham in Girls, Kumail Nanjiani in The Big Sick, Pete Holmes in Crashing. His best work comes when he helps others not only gain a platform for their success, but also a sort of launch pad for them to deal with their own sort of traumas, issues, and stories. The second thing that he's really good at is mixing this outrageous content with really vulnerable and heartfelt messages. This movie is about Pete Davidson dealing with the death of his father, but it's also a love letter to people who make sacrifices. Like his mom. His mom in this film, played by Marissa Tomei, is an emergency services officer. She's a nurse. She works in 2 ERs and a school, I think. It's a message for the firefighters that go out and risk their lives every day. And it's a love letter to Pete himself. Not everyone obviously has the platform to deal with their traumas in a multi-million-dollar film. But since Pete Davidson did get that opportunity, I'm very glad that he took it in the most authentic ways possible. And I'm glad that he chose Judd Apatow to be the one to do it with him. One of the criticisms of Judd Apatow actually is that his movies are too long. But, this movie running at 136 minutes might be a bit too long for some people. But I think it's great because, what Apatow does is build these characters that you really want to root for. And you really want to root for Pete Davidson in this film. But you wouldn't want to watch him develop in that third act when he goes to the firehouse unless you saw him take the beating he did in the first 2 acts. You wouldn't want to root for Pete Davidson in this film until you saw the pain of him being left behind by his overachieving sister. The pain of him dealing with the prospect of inviting another fireman into his life in the form of Ray, his mother's boyfriend, played by Bill Burr, in an absolutely stunning performance, by the way. But you wouldn't want to root for Pete Davidson's character Scott unless you watch him deal with who he is and understand his character. You know, and part of his character is this urgency-free worldview. And that's what makes this such a poignant character study of Scott Carlin. The film opens with this really, really, really out of character sequence for Judd Apatow, where one of his characters tries to commit suicide. Like, you will not see that in his other movies. It's actually quite dark for his movies. But that's who Pete Davidson is. Pete Davidson has been open about his own suicidal feelings, and watching an Apatow film open with that marks the point that this is a different Apatow film. That's why I think this is his best film yet. He's not caught up in making the funniest joke possible. He's not caught up in making everyone laugh. This time, it's about Pete Davidson's story. This time it's about making it as authentic as humanly possible. And you can see that in the fact that Pete Davidson's grandfather has a scene in this film. One of the funniest scenes. It's during Scott Carlin's sister's graduation party. He comes on and he talks about how college is a waste of time, how Donald Trump went to Wharton, and other sort of infamous historical figures went to college. Apatow, in an effort to make the firehouse seem as sort of organic and realistic as possible, filmed in an actual Staten Island firehouse, used some of the real firefighters from that house who are also actors in the film. And one of the main firefighters is Steve Buscemi, who was an actual firefighter before he became an actor. And Steve Buscemi, again, really incredible really incredible performance in the film. He only shows up for a few scenes, but they're so powerful and they're so natural. Another thing that they do is they don't shy away from Pete Davidson's issues. As I've said before, not only the mental ones, but the physical ones. Pete Davidson has Crohn's disease, and they talk about it in a scene in the film. And Crohn's disease is not a very pleasant disease. I'm going to leave that one for you to look up. But they also use the real stories and the real sort of arc of Pete Davidson's thinking towards his father. In interviews, Pete Davidson talks about how everything he heard about his father was that he was a hero. But one day, his father's friends took him out and told him this really insane story that had drugs and police officers and crime and everything, which humanized him for him. And essentially that is the core of the film's message. He needed not only this, but everything that's led to it, to deal with it, and then to move on to become the star that he eventually will be. I think what also makes this film as great as it is the supporting cast. Marissa Tomei is probably the most experienced actor on the set, outside of Steve Buscemi, and she is so good as Scott Carlin's mom in this film. I think her and Bill Burr have this incredible chemistry, which is surprising because Bill Burr is not someone you usually expect to have, a sort of romantic chemistry that you want to aspire to. But him and Tomei, there's this scene that comes to mind where, they first start flirting, and Marissa Tomei says this line, "I'm Rusty, you're subtle, nice to meet you." And it's so cute. you want to root for them as well. Bill Burr really, really gives one of his best performances, at least from what I've seen. As well as Pamela Adlon is in this film, and Pamela Adlon can do no wrong. If you haven't had a chance, watch Better Things on FX or on Hulu. It's a fantastic show. She writes it, stars in it. She really makes that show what it is. But in this film as well, she has like a couple of short scenes, but you feel like she's actually done the work to put in a backstory, to make the character believable, to make the character different and authentic. One of the most authentic parts of the film is Ricky Alvarez, as I said. And Maud Apatow. Maud Apatow she uses her character to inject a certain sense of urgency into the film, which, some people say might be quite necessary, especially the ones who think that it's too long. But all of these characters that I've mentioned deserve their own movies. And if there's one thing that I've been taught at film school, is that unless your secondary characters deserve their own movies, you haven't made them as fleshed out as possible. And I think that's a testament to Pete's writing, to Judd's writing, and to Pete's writing partner, Dave Cyrus's writing. All three of them have written an incredible film. And you just know that they did the work to mine Pete Davidson's life, to come up with the best and most funny, most heartwarming, most vulnerable situations, to really allow this character to go through the change that he needs to. One of the things I like to do when I talk about films is give certain awards. And one of the awards that I give is the Michael Jordan Carey Award for the film, and in this case I think Pete Davidson gets that. He did it all. He dictated the voice of this film. His blasé approach to dealing with these real emotions and really like dark trauma just makes it more approachable, like I said, and that's what makes the film. But also the commitment to authenticity. Without that, it would be another hollow film about a directionless pothead who we don't care about because he's wasting away his life. What draws us to Pete Davidson is we want to root for him, and that's what drew Judd Apatow to Pete Davidson in the first place. That's what made him the star he is today. We want to root for Pete Davidson. Another award that I like to give is the Limitless Most Underrated Award, because I think Limitless, starring Bradley Cooper, is one of the most underrated films in the world. And for that, I think Bill Burr deserves that award, because he shows his acting chops, his incredible comic timing. He's one of the world's top stand-up comedians at the moment. But also the arc that he goes through. He starts off as this sort of straightforward, straight-shooting, angry Staten Island man, but then goes in to show so many dimensions and so much depth that he creates this almost incredibly believable character. One of the most believable in the entire movie. At the end of the day, I think The King of Staten Island is a film about sacrifice. It's about a film about the people who are affected by sacrifice and those who have to make them. It's a celebration of first responders. It's a celebration of Pete moving on to the next stage of his life. But it's also a celebration of the work and determination that you have to put in if you want to change. I think Judd Apatow and Pete Davidson have done a brilliant job with this film, and I'd give it about a 7 out of 10. Alright, let's take a break here. We'll be back with my next segment, Comedic Escapism, what to watch to numb yourself to the rest of the world. And followed by that, we'll discuss my spicy take about Hindi films and how they're not all Bollywood movies. And we'll close off with the 5 movies I watched before coming to college in the US to understand American culture. We'll be right back.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. We just spoke about The King of Staten Island, my pick for movie of the week, and how you should definitely watch it, unless you're an Ariana Grande fan, in which case I say, God help you. Later on in the show, we're going to talk about the top 5 movies I watched before coming to school in the US to get an understanding of what American culture will be like. Spoiler alert, I didn't learn much. But let's get on to the second segment. This segment is funny. I like because a lot of the world is in shambles right now. And one of the ways I've been getting through that is by watching a series of Adam Sandler-esque movies, I guess you could call them. Anything with comedic escapism. Which is why the segment is called Comedic Escapism. What to watch when you're tired of watching the world burn on the news. So today's pick is Will Ferrell's latest movie, Eurovision Song Contest, The Story of Fire Saga. Now, this film is about Lars Eriksson, played by Will Ferrell, and Sigrid Eriksdotter, played by Rachel McAdams, who they will continually remind you are not siblings, or at least they think, who head to the Eurovision Song Contest to represent Iceland against all odds. And when I mean all odds, I mean all odds. Because there's also elves, murder, and ridiculous costumes. The movie's directed by David Dobkin of Wedding Crashers fame, and it's written by Will Ferrell and Andrew Steele. Now, just for a bit of context for those of you who may not know what Eurovision is, because it's a huge thing outside of America, it's this yearly song contest which pits each country in the continent against each other in a battle of songwriting, and it's existed since the mid-1950s and generally uses the musical trends of about a decade ago to sort of inform the musical choices of the songs that are put up. Some of the most famous people to come out of Eurovision actually are ABBA, who represented Sweden, Celine Dion, who surprisingly, despite being French-Canadian, represented Switzerland, and Olivia Newton-John, who represented the UK. And that points me to one of the inconsistencies in this film, one of the many inconsistencies in this film, that troubled me. And that is that somehow Eurovision in this film, which is usually, so Eurovision every year is held in the country of the contestant who won the previous year. So in this film, Eurovision is held in Edinburgh, which somehow implies that the UK could win a Eurovision, which is beyond me completely. That being said, Eurovision is this crazy festival where vampire or demonic metal bands, or even a group of Russian ladies baking on stage can win. The fans are almost as crazy as the show, and it's this kitsch-filled festival of weirdness and outdated music tastes that occupies the entire continent and a good part of the world every year. And it's a world with its own strange rules that, is the perfect ripe ground for a Will Ferrell satire. The same way he did with local news in Anchorman and with NASCAR in Talladega Nights. So let's get into it. I think while this movie is wildly hilarious, there are moments that it is so funny. It probably should have stayed as the sketch that Will Ferrell originated the idea for, to be honest, because it feels like a really high-budget SNL sketch stretch to be like 2 hours long. But that being said, Dobkin and Ferrell truly understood the crucial balance of absurdity and confidence that make Eurovision work. And that's what makes the characters in this film really go for it. Like most Will Ferrell movies, these characters are sort of these earnest creations. They're like these really, I guess you could call them buffoons, who are invested with this belief that what they're doing is special and out there and beyond anything. It's what Ron Burgundy is, but this is also what Lars Eriksson is. He knows from the bottom of his heart that he's going to win Eurovision. And this dream starts in the opening sequence of the film where he watches... he's wallowing on the staircase because his mother has just passed away. And his father and some friends are watching the Eurovision Song Contest. And ABBA comes on and starts performing Waterloo. This miraculously takes young Lars out of his funk and puts him in front of the stage and makes him dance and feel excited again. Watching from behind, Sigrid, young Sigrid, starts to dance along with him. Lars stops and announces to the people in his house that he will one day win Eurovision. To which everyone says, you're going to make a fool of yourself. Especially his father, who does not believe in him whatsoever. Lars' father is played by Pierce Brosnan in this film, who I have to say looks incredible. But I also have to say, I'm glad he doesn't sing in this film, because, as I'll talk about in a bit, his singing did not help Mamma Mia, and I'm really happy that it didn't have the chance to do the same for this film. So, with this film, I think one of the biggest sort of weapons for it was it's an ensemble cast. As I said, Will Ferrell is the main actor in this, but he's joined by Rachel McAdams. He's joined by Pierce Brosnan and a slew of other actors, a lot of them from Scandinavian heritage. McAdams herself is this great dramatic actress who, as many people have seen in films like Mean Girls and Game Night, knows how to play a straight face in the most ridiculous of settings. And that's what makes her one of the funniest dramatic actors in Hollywood. And she brings that to this film again. Which is why I want to give her the Michael Jordan Carey Award for this film. She's so good in this film. Her acting is... You just want to root for her. And her arc is the best. It follows this... So her character starts off by not being able to speak. But Lars sort of teaches her to sing. And in that she develops her own voice. But the story is not about that. It's about her finding her own voice. Which culminates in this legend of the Spjorg note. Okay, sidebar. The Spjörg is supposed to be this like artistic achievement in like Icelandic folklore that they speak about, where if you hit it, you reach like this ethereal, artistic, astral state. And she actually does, spoiler alert, she actually does hit this note at the end of the film. Hot take, but it actually sounds really bad. Like, it sounds like she's screaming into the mic. It goes like, ah! Which, not very pleasant, especially if you're wearing headphones and it's the middle of the night. But you've been warned. Despite that, Rachel McAdams is this sort of lovable dreamer character that wants to be there for the person who helped take her out of her funk in the form of Lars, but also wants to find her own voice. And in that, she really, really inspires the sort of emotional stakes of the film. You know, this film has faced its fair share of criticism, which I understand. You know, it's not the best. The script is really predictable. It's more predictable than having a shirtless scene in a Ryan Gosling film. Which, actually, speaking of, you know, it's quite interesting to watch Rachel McAdams' career progression from kissing Ryan Gosling in movies, who's a certified heartthrob, to now Will Ferrell. I don't think she's getting enough good roles, and I think she deserves more. That's not to say that Will Ferrell isn't one of the smartest men in comedy. He just hasn't had a good movie since the other guys. Another problem with the film that I have is that the accents turn on and off like a faulty faucet. But, you know, and you know, it's surprising because Will Ferrell, part of the reason this movie was made is that Will Ferrell's wife is Swedish, and she introduced him to the Eurovision in 1999 when Sweden won. And you'd expect him to have like a really good and solid Scandinavian accent, but just keeps going on and off, and sometimes it's British, sometimes it's Australian. When he's speaking to the Americans in the film, it goes back to American. Visually, you can tell which parts have been digitally sort of mixed with additional dialogue post-production. But at the end of the day, this is a comedy that knows how to make fun of what its subject is and how to have fun with it. You know, one of the best scenes in this film is this song sequence in the middle that reminded me a lot of, it's like a crossover between Pitch Perfect and Mamma Mia, in the sense that it brings together all of these old Eurovision stars for this cameo of a bunch of these really, what I assume are popular with Eurovision audiences' songs. I haven't really heard many of them, but I'm guessing, like the show itself, they're at least 10 years old. But it's just this powerful sort of bringing together of multiple voices, including Will Ferrell's voice. Will Ferrell actually sings for himself in this film, unlike Rachel McAdams, whose voice is digitally mixed with an Icelandic singer. I think her name is Mai Madeline. But Will Ferrell, I don't know if it's been auto-tuned or what, but he actually sounds really good. Including in this mashup. But that scene is this really fun experience, which is very uncharacteristic for David Hopkins, because you know his films, especially like the Robert Downey Jr. film The Judge, they have this sort of cynical lens to them. But having something like this, having that Volcano Man music video sequence in the beginning, where Will Ferrell is dressed like a space Viking, set against these beautiful Icelandic vistas, I guess you could call them. He's having fun with this film, and that's exactly the kind of film we need at this point. something to have fun with, something to help us get distracted for a moment. Now, I will say there are important movements going on, and being distracted is probably not very productive for the movements, especially if you believe in these causes. But it's movies like this that help us realize the joy in the world, the things that we're fighting for, because this film shows you what multicultural experiences can do when they come together. You know, you have all of these different cultures and different outlooks in this film, all over Europe, I guess you could say, but even with that being said, it still shows you what happens when you put them all together. You can make something great. This film is the ideal comedic escape if you don't want to watch the world burn down on the news. And for that, I think it deserves more than what I'd want to give it at 5 out of 10 for, its actual quality. But it's a good movie to watch to distract yourself at the end of the day. Right. With that, let's take another quick break. We've just spoken about Eurovision Song Contest, the Story of Fire Saga. Up next, we have my hot take of the week, where we're going to talk about how not all Hindi films are Bollywood. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC movie podcast. So far we've spoken about two great American comedies, Pete Davidson's The King of Staten Island and Will Ferrell's Eurovision Song Contest, The Story of Fire Saga. I want to take the third segment, the segment that I call my hot take, my spicy take, to talk a bit about myself. Now, as I said in the intro, I grew up in India and Singapore. But growing up in India, one of the main sort of influences on my life, especially in terms of what I'm currently pursuing right now, was what many Americans consider Bollywood. Today I'm here to correct your assumption. While you are right, Bollywood exists. Bollywood is the name of the mainstream Hindi film industry based in Bombay, hence the B in Hollywood. It produces around 800 films a year, sells more than 4 billion tickets. India, in fact, produces the most movies in the world per year, and sells the most amount of tickets as well. But it's mostly based around family-friendly entertainment, songs, elaborate dance sequences, heroic action, melodrama. It's also known for being very long, about 3 hours. But the word Bollywood and this perception of what the mainstream Hindi film industry is, or at least has been, has hindered India's cinematic development in a way that I feel is now finally changing. A lot of actors involved in the industry have publicly said that Bollywood as a nickname has messed with our perception as sort of lacking credibility and not art in the same way that American films, or at least even European films, are considered. And it reflects this sort of inferiority complex towards Hollywood, which is supposed to be the beacon. But as we've seen from last year's Oscars, and from just the overall general positive trend towards international films in general, I feel like it's time to bring America and the rest of the world's attention to Hindi cinema, because they're really coming out with some incredible work. And, I understand people who don't want to watch movies with subtitles. But I used to be one of those people, and I realized that it was limiting not only the inspirations I could have of my own through watching film, but also the different perspectives and different ideas that you get from movies outside of your own home country. Now, I grew up on American films. I'm not going to say anything. Hindi is not a language that I'm very comfortable with, and I can speak it, but I can't write or read. And I assume a lot of you listening also probably can't, which is why I'd like to bring you in with my favorite Hinglish film. Hindi and English, for those of you who don't understand the reference. Delhi Belly. But before we get into Delhi Belly, here's just a little sort of background on how Bollywood is changing. Well, Hindi cinema at least. Now, 65% of India's population is under 25. We have the largest young population in the world in India. And a lot of these people have grown up with things outside of the traditional soap opera, TV serial scene, and have outgrown the kitschy, Bollywoody dance number movie that inspired Baz Luhrmann's Moulin Rouge. They want stories of urban anxieties. They want real stories, and that change has been reflecting in not only Hindi cinema, but also since the rise of streaming within India, TV shows and other visual mediums. This is a generation that grew up on things like Friends and The Sopranos and The Simpsons, and the traditional song and dance film formula just doesn't do it for them anymore. We're tired of seeing the same actors do the same roles and save the same girls. We want to see movies that aren't based in the patriarchy. We want to see movies that aren't about privileged upper caste Indians. And one of the best examples of this is the 2011 film Delhi Belly. Now, Delhi Belly, when you hear the word Delhi Belly, you expect it to be about the commonly Delhi Belly as a phrase is commonly associated with the the digestive problem, as they call it, the traveler's curse that many people who visit India get. It's a form of food poisoning, I suppose, that people who aren't really used to the earthy way of cooking Indian food on the streets might end up getting at the end of a trip. And this is sort of the basis of the film itself. The film is this comic and satirical take on the wildness of what Delhi can be. And it starts with this loving perspective of Delhi street food. and how unhygienic it is. It causes one of the main characters, played by Kunal Roy Kapoor, to eventually develop a case of Delhi belly himself, and go to the doctor with a stool sample to try to figure out what's going on with him. And this starts a chain of events that involves the stool sample being switched with a similar size package of contraband that I don't want to spoil, headed towards a gangster, and leads to a different type of Indian movie, written majoritarily in English, filled with rudeness, crudeness, and sexual candor, and one that defies every rule that was in place for what Hindi cinema looked like before this. The screenwriter develops this tight comic plot around these three roommates, a journalist, a graphic artist, and a photographer, who are chased around Delhi by gangsters after that stool mix-up that I referred to earlier. The film explores the existential milieu of these three characters living in young Delhi, with a particular emphasis on their bathroom. But it also shows and gives us an understanding as to what young, urban, and educated life in India. But it also shows us in a quite sweet way what a young, urban, and educated life in India is, and how these three deal with careers, love, and happiness in the same way any indie film in the United States would. I mean, this isn't the first type of indie sensibility movie in Indian cinema, but it's the first with a big Bollywood powerhouse behind it. One of the biggest stars in Bollywood, Amir Khan. You might know him from a movie called Three Idiots or Lagan, if you've ever seen those. Is the producer behind this film, and his, I believe, nephew plays one of the main characters in this film as well. He also shows up in a spoofy musical number designed to satirize what normal Bollywood musical numbers are, as a disco fighter, and does so in a very impressive manner. There's many aspects of this film that make it the special sort of entrance that I suggest into Hindi cinema. One is because it's in English, and a lot of you will prefer to watch a movie in English rather than subtitles. I know I would. And at least you don't have to go through the Netflix audio dubbing in English, which is usually just terrible. The second is that it's on Netflix. But the third and the most important is that it's a departure from the typical Indian comedy, which is usually a slapstick based on some juvenile premise. The humor in this is situational. It's beautifully woven in the script, and it doesn't have to ever depend on a character falling over on a banana or through the windshield of a car. You know, it's a story that mixes one of the most unusual sort of premises, you know, the swapping of a stool sample with a gangster's contraband, in a way that just works, but also shows you what life in urban India now is like, what life for the population under 25 that is educated, that has grown up on these similar indie films in the United States. And it shows what we want Indian cinema to go towards. Now, I'm a big believer in the fact that just because it's the first doesn't mean that it's the best, and that is very true. There are a lot of new movies that are coming out that share the same sort of audience and the same sort of sensibilities to talk about. One of the most important one of these is Andhadhun, which, if you do get a chance, you should watch after, and I would love to talk about in more depth on another episode. But this film is carried by its performances. Its performances by Veer Das, who is now the leading stand-up comedian for India. He has 3 specials on Netflix, another recommendation for you to check out. As well as Vijay Raz as the gangster, who has made his name within the Bollywood scene. But I think one of the most important heroes of what makes this film is the Indian censor board. Now, even in the US, there are ratings, but a lot of the times in India, films that don't necessarily meet the larger sort of cultural anxieties, in the sense that films that portray explicit sexual content, films that talk about issues such as homosexuality, and in some cases even feminist ideas, like the film Lipstick on My Burqa, which was sort of pushed against by the censor board for a long time. A lot of these films don't get the light of day because of the more power that the censor board in India has. And with this film being released in its entirety without taking away from so many of its lewd and ludicrous aspects, you really have to give the censor board props. At the end of the day, Delhi Belly is this incredible example of an Indian film that not only matches foreign films in their high concept comedy, their independent sensibilities, and the talent and filmmaking prowess, but also sets up this foundation for not only Indian films in the future, but also for foreign audiences to venture into Indian films. It's the perfect stepping stone for you to enter this huge industry with more than 15 languages and countless thousands of stories that are yet to be discovered. Delhi Belly is a fine example of the brightest and the boldest and the strongest artists in an industry coming together to create a film that challenges every single tradition of an aging industry. And I think you should really watch it. Right, and with that, let's take our final break for the episode. Stay tuned, because next we have my 5 films that allowed me to try to understand what American culture might be like before I came to college in the United States, and how I was terribly wrong. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
The GSMC movie podcast with me, Shubh Nanda. For our final section today, and thank you for sticking by me thus far. I know it must have been hard to do after I tried to hit the Spjorg note earlier on. But I wanted to take this opportunity to go into a more personal aspect of film and its relationship to me, and how I use it to sort of understand the world around me. One of these ways was that I used some films to try to figure out what I might expect when I was coming to America for college. I'd been to America before, for summer vacations, for a couple of internships, but living in America was still this daunting prospect for me. And right before I came to college, the summer before, I had nothing to do, so I watched every movie I could think of and more. That was part of the reason for me ending up actually studying film at college in America, but also I sort of thought that it would help me figure out what I might have to expect coming in. So these are the 5 films that I used to try to understand American culture before I came to the US for college. So the first film I'd say is Superbad. Superbad is probably my unironically favorite movie of all time. A lot of people are really suspicious of this, especially in film school. So I tell them that my favorite movie of all time is probably something like The Social Network, or something more respectable in the artistic sense. Name some random Godard movie or something. But Superbad, if I tell you my favorite movie is Superbad, I'm being honest with you. It's my favorite movie because it sort of explained to me what American humor is like, especially in terms of masculinity. It satirizes that toxic masculinity that we are overcoming as a people. In just one "I love you" scene at the end of the film, it's beautiful. It talks about how, well, it taught me at least about how a lot of American humor is deeply rooted in, well, at least male humor, in sex and alcohol. And America's very open with sex, for starters. I don't think I would have been drawing the male member as Jonah Hill's character Seth was in a flashback, which is actually my favorite scene. So he goes into this flashback to explain to Michael Cera's character about why the girl that he's into is not a very nice person. And he talks about how he had this sort of addiction to drawing the male member, and the girl told on him, and he eventually had to stop eating foods shaped like the male member. And he says this really funny line. He goes, "Do you know how many foods are shaped like the male member? All the best kinds." And the thing that it taught me was that American humor is very different and very open about things that might have been taboo back home. The second film for me is a must-see if you're coming to America, because it's literally called Coming to America. The film is about the essential culture shock that you feel when you arrive in America and how it's completely different. It stars Eddie Murphy, who plays Prince Akeem, the Prince of Zamunda, who comes on a trip to find a wife. And it taught me a couple of things. One, that the barbershop is where all the important cultural discussions take place. Like all of them. Everything. And the second is that Queens and the apartments in Queens are kind of run down. And that cab drivers in New York can be rude. Quite rude, actually. Whilst this has some certain rings of truth to it, there are some cab drivers in New York, especially some of the Indian ones that I can connect with. And Queens is probably the best place to get Indian food, which is definitely something I learned after coming to America. But the message is still valid, that you come to America and you learn something new, completely new about it, because we have these expectations that come from all the media that we consume, which is essentially the point of this list. My favorite quote and scene in this film is when he wakes up in his apartment and exits, goes onto the fire exit and screams, "Good morning, my neighbors." And someone responds, "Hey, F you." And he just goes back and says, "Yes, yes, F you too." It's Eddie Murphy, peak comedy. I think it's his best movie after Beverly Hills Cop. I guess the third film for me, which is almost very specific, is Lady Bird, Greta Gerwig's film starring Saoirse Ronan. This taught me a lot more serious issues that are affecting students in the United States. One of this is that there's a large number of highly qualified, low-income high school students in the U.S. that aren't even applying to the schools that they're qualified to attend just because of how expensive higher education can be. But it also taught me that controlling and possessive mums aren't just an Indian thing, and in fact they exist everywhere. That's one of the aspects of the film that I really enjoyed, was seeing that, controlling moms are an archetype worldwide. Another thing I learned from this film is that superficially deep boys can be attractive. And this is in direct reference to Timothée Chalamet's character. He has this scene where he goes off on this rant about how cell phones are tracking devices, and you can just see Lady Bird's attracted to that. She's into that bad boy, like, off the grid, not into the system vibe. And that sort of still exists. Like, I've seen that around NYU for sure. Like, that's a very common type of person at NYU. My favorite scene in this film is the abortion seminar. So this lady is talking about how she's a pro-life lady, obviously, and she's talking about abortion and how it's morally incorrect. And Lady Bird gets caught saying something, and she just goes back and says, "If your mom had had the abortion, we wouldn't be here listening to the seminar." And I thought that was one of the funniest lines I've ever seen in film. Next up, we have Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump is an essential movie to understand American culture, I think. It talks about the American belief that one person has the power to create a collective memory for an entire nation. It shows that by putting him in every single sort of major event from the 50s to the 80s. But it also talks about how America is built on a troubled past. It shows the effects of the Vietnam War. It talks about the AIDS epidemic, the wealth gap. Forrest is named after the Grand Wizard of the KKK. And it's not afraid to deal with those issues, like a lot of America still is today. But it also talks about how resilience and perseverance are what lead to success in America, which is, an important message. But there's also a hint of luck and being in the right place at the right time. My favorite scene in the film is the Vietnam protest, where Forrest goes up on stage and his definitely moving speech about the Vietnam War is cut short by an army officer, I suppose. But it ends with Forrest and Jenny reuniting. Now, Jenny is one of the most hated characters in film history, and I'm not going to oppose that. I think she is a terrible, terrible person as a character. But you have to admit that reuniting in the middle of the memorial in the water, that's a special moment, and that was a special scene. But my favorite quote from the film is at the end of his 3-year-long run, where he says, "I'm pretty tired. I think I'll go home now." And it just shows the power that a symbolic gesture can have, which is what the next film that I'm going to talk about is about. And this is Wag the Dog. Wag the Dog is this film by Barry Levinson starring Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman that tracks a political spin doctor played by Robert De Niro and a Hollywood producer played by Dustin Hoffman who create a war, basically, for the news media in order to divert from a presidential sex scandal right before an election. And I think this is a pretty poignant movie for everyone to watch right now, mainly because it talks about how the media packaging of war is incredibly shallow and unquestioning, and war correspondents abandon any pretense of objectivity just to sort of root for their side. And it taught me that war is show business, just like the media can be spun and controlled in any way. And that seems to be one of the biggest issues in the US right now. The film is very important because it talks about how politics can often influence and control the media, and a simple diversion is all that's needed to retract from an important message. You know, it comes into play right now where you see the downplaying of the coronavirus in the media, but also the picking and choosing of the coverage of the protests for racial equity in the US. You know, there was a disproportionate amount of coverage towards the rioting and looting as compared to the actual peaceful forces of change. But this film is also very important in understanding how the US eventually used this and harnessed this power of media to enter a war in Iraq and devastate the Middle East. My favorite scene in the film is Robert De Niro's character explaining to Dustin Hoffman's character that war is show business. He says, "That's show business. Naked girl covered in napalm, V for victory, 5 Marines raising the flag. You remember the picture 50 years from the war, you'll have forgotten the war." And, you know, my favorite quote in the film is him saying, "What did television ever do to you?" And a member of the presidential staff says, "It destroyed the electoral process." I think this film is very important for people to understand, and it definitely helped me understand how important the media is when it comes to politics. And it's just a scathing satire that helped me understand the landscape of how stuff works. At the end of the day, films are what shape a lot of my understanding of a culture that I was definitely foreign to. And coming into America with this sort of breadth of cultural awareness, while it wasn't necessarily whole and completely accurate, definitely gave me a good starting point to assimilate, which is, to me, eventually what the power of cinema is. You know, movies have the power to help distract us from real-world problems sometimes, because there are moments where we need rest. Films exist to help us understand real-world problems, like Wag the Dog. And films sometimes just make us smile. In the case of Pete Davidson, films can be the vehicle through which we explore our own demons. And in the case of Superbad, films can show a transition from a certain understanding of something to a new cultural paradigm. Cinema has this incredible power of being life itself. I don't know what I'd do without it. And with that, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That would really help us. Also, if you would please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www GSMCpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.